As we've been discussing, in the wake of multiple assassinations conducted across the region by Israel, we are now on the brink of a very dangerous escalation. Everyone's sort of waiting to see what Iran is going to do in response. So as we await that, we're bringing in Dr. Trita Parsi from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft to tell us where we are and where we could be headed. Great to see you again, Doctor.
Good to see you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Let's go ahead and put this first element up on the screen that just sort of summarizes everything. This is from journalist Joyce Karam. She says, update, Iran attack scene as early as Monday. U.S. forces arriving in the region, CENTCOM chief, Israel tomorrow per Barak Ravid. Israel says plans in place for nationals leaving Lebanon. Hezbollah and allies coordinate response, strikes in Gaza. Houthis target ships. That's sort of the top line of where we're at. Just give us a sense of how we got here and what you expect.
Well, we've spoken about this numerous times, that the Israelis, particularly the Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has for years tried to push the United States to go to war with Iran, and choosing to assassinate Haniyeh during the inauguration of Pezeshkian, the new Iranian president, in Tehran, whereas the Israelis clearly had the ability to do so while he was in Doha, since he lives there, is a clear indication that they were trying to do something that would be as escalatory as possible. The question is, will the Iranians now walk into that trap? And the signal that they're sending is that they will retaliate, and that if the Israelis respond, then they will continue it. And they've essentially told foreign diplomats that they have a right to retaliate if it leads to war. Essentially, it's on Israel, not on Iran. In some ways, the Iranians have trapped themselves in an escalatory cycle. They took absorbed a lot of hits from Israel over the years. Numerous scientists that were assassinated. The head of the Iranian nuclear program was assassinated. The Iranians did not retaliate openly. After the attack against the Iranian embassy in Syria, decided to do so. And as a result, now, after this assassination that is not necessarily much worse than previous assassinations, they're in a corner in which they have to, in their view, retaliate. Otherwise, their efforts to restore the deterrence has completely collapsed and failed, which is, again, part of the risk of retaliating in the first place. You put yourself in a position in which you constantly have to respond if the Israelis are not deterred, which in this case, clearly, they've chosen that they're not.
Right. So, Dr. Parsi, what we've learned is that there was a meeting in which apparently the Iranians told the Gulf Arab states, they said, we don't care, if this does lead to war. Now, how much of this is bravado? How much of it is reality? And what are the political constraints within the regime itself that might drive their decision makings in the next 24 hours?
I think much of that is bravado. I think the Iranians are going to respond in such a way that it minimizes the likelihood that it will lead to a significant escalation and a war. But still, it will be more than what we saw in April. In April, they went out of their ways to avoid any casualties on the Israeli side. That's not likely going to be the case this time around. I think they will actually try to draw blood this time around as a way of restoring that deterrence, so to say. The risk, obviously, is that you have a prime minister in Israel that actually wants escalation, and as a result will use that as an opportunity to be able to escalate further. And I think it's in that regard that the Iranians are saying they don't care if it goes in that direction. I think they do, but I don't think that they will abide by what appears to have been American messages to Tehran of what the U.S. would consider to be acceptable response from Iran. I think the Iranians are likely going to go quite a bit beyond that, but perhaps not so far that it will give the Israelis a very clear justification for further escalation.
So the U.S. Secretary of Defense immediately jumped out and said, the U.S. will have Israel's back. We are now getting, we can put this next element up on the screen, the umpteenth version of the Biden is having tough conversations and is really mad at Bibi Netanyahu behind the scenes. Biden realized that Netanyahu was lying to him about the hostages, per Haaretz. He's not saying it publicly yet, but in the meeting between them, he specifically told Bibi, stop bullshitting me. So that's the leaks that are coming out of the latest meetings. Just reflect a little bit on that, and also how the calculus may have changed for Bibi, given that Biden is now a lame duck and Kamala Harris is the top of the Democratic ticket.
think the White House's efforts to try to signal that they actually are tough with Netanyahu leaves them in a position in which they're portraying themselves as quite pathetic. They're trying to say that we are being tough by leaking this information about what is being said behind the scenes. But reality is that if that is actually what is being said and Netanyahu is not responding, it clearly shows that Biden is choosing not to use the actual leverage he has, which is to actually stop the arms supplies to Israel. And as a result, Netanyahu has absolutely no reasons to listen to Biden or take his threats or his harsh words in these mythological conversations behind the scenes particularly seriously. And this is part of the reason why we are in this situation now. We would not be in this situation if Biden actually had used America's leverage from the outset. He could have forced a ceasefire much earlier on. He chose not to. And even in April, when he actually, for the first time, did use some leverage against the Israelis and prevented them from escalating further, nevertheless, it wasn't successful because here we are. 2-3 months later, and Netanyahu did something even more provocative than he did when he bombed the Iranian embassy, consular section of the embassy in Damascus. It clearly shows that Biden's strategy of never actually being tough with the Israelis has been a complete disaster for U.S. national interests, because this war, if it breaks out in that large format, very likely will drag the United States into another war. And I think Netanyahu came back from Washington after being here last week, realizing that the White House was quite a bit in a disarray as a result of Biden not really happily abdicating the ticket. And as a result, saw an opportunity to escalate dramatically, and by that, force a conflict and a crisis on the next president of the United States, whether it is Trump or whether it is Kamala Harris.
Yeah, Dr. Parsi, how does Hezbollah factor into this? So there's, of course, an Iranian response, but there are also Iranian allies like Hezbollah and others. They themselves are on the brink of a war. We have diplomatic, nightmare right now with Lebanon, all U.S. citizens being urged to leave. There's canceled flights. Everybody is bracing. So even if there is a quote unquote tempered response from the Iranians directly, what still holds on the front between Israel and Hezbollah?
So I think it's a very important question you ask, and I think it's important to bear in mind that when the Israelis took out the head of Hamas in Tehran, that happened just hours or days after they had taken out the number 2 in Hezbollah in Lebanon. And the world was bracing itself for a potential escalation between Hezbollah and Israel. And in that moment, where everyone was hoping that there would be de-escalation, the Israelis decided to kill Haniyeh in Tehran, clearly indicating that their desire actually is to escalate and bring about some larger war. If there is an attack, and I think there's an extremely high likelihood that the Iranians will respond, it will likely be a coordinated response from Hezbollah, Iran, Iraqi Syrian militias, as well as the Houthis in Yemen. Part of the risk of that is that some of these elements are far more eager to actually move towards a larger war than the Iranians are. The Iranians have been very calibrating and cautious. They've had plenty of opportunities to escalate. They've chosen not to. But the Houthis, for instance, have a very different calculation. They have publicly complained that the Iranians are trying to hold them back. Some of the Iraqi and Syrian militias have also complained about their unhappiness of Iran trying to restrain them. So if we end up in this larger war, and at some point there is a serious effort to de-escalate, the question is, will there be discipline within the ranks of these different groups that are aligned with Iran to actually go along with such a de-escalation? Or will we have a very chaotic situation in which some of them may be willing to de-escalate and others will not? And as a result, we may not get the actual de-escalation that may be desired in certain parts. So this is a very significant risk now as a result of this major deliberate escalation that Netanyahu has brought about.
Dr. Parsi, in that same article where, an aide is leaking that Biden told Bibi this is bullshit, and he realized finally that Bibi was lying about the hostages. It's obviously long been clear that Bibi Netanyahu had no interest.
Took him 10 months, apparently.
Right. Yeah, it's just preposterous. But in that same article, this official says the U.S. is preparing to help Israel in the face of Iran and Hezbollah's response. However, they made it clear there would be no American backing for moves that would further expand the scope of the conflict. Do you give that any credence? Because it is very hard for me to believe that we would actually, allow Israel to face Iran, Hezbollah alone, that we wouldn't once again jump to their rescue.
Well, this is what Biden said last time as well. We'll come in and defend you this time, but don't escalate further. And guess what? 2-3 months later, Netanyahu escalated dramatically and much further than he did the first time around. As long as Biden constantly comes to Netanyahu's aid, despite all of these leaked stories about being angry behind the scenes, the reality is he's given Netanyahu a blank check, or he has been so weak in his response that Netanyahu is treating it as if he's gotten a blank check from Biden. To come now and say, we'll help you this time, but don't escalate further, well, that's exactly what was said 3 months ago. And here we are. At some point, either Biden needs to put down his foot, use the leverage that he has to put a stop to this, or he's going to be responsible for the United States getting dragged into yet another disastrous war in the Middle East.
Yes, and Dr. Parsa, the U.S. posture right now is one that is signaling war. We have the carrier strike group there. We have several thousand U.S. Service members that are already in the region. Previously, we had seen, obviously, we had dedicated enormous resources to the United States, Great Britain, Jordan, and others. And so if there is some sort of bigger conflagration, do you have any doubt that the U.S. would get involved here?
I have absolutely no doubt that the United States will be doing exactly what it did last time in terms of shooting down Iranian missiles, etc. The question is, will the U.S. go beyond that? Will it use fighter jets? Will it use other things to start directly targeting, whether it is Iraqi militias, Hezbollah, or even Iran itself? At this point, I find that not very likely, at least in the early stages of this. However, the way this may play out is that the Iranians strike Israel together with some of these other groups. It will cause damage, it will cause casualties, and then the question is, what will Israel's response be? If the Israelis then respond, and if they respond particularly disproportionately, the message Iran has sent is that they're ready for numerous waves of attacks against Israel. Under those circumstances, particularly if Israel is taking very significant hits, I find it unlikely that the Biden administration in particular will be able to resist the pressure to get directly involved in that war. And that's when the United States will be at full scale.
Dr. Parsi, always invaluable to have your insights, especially in such an important and fraught time. So thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show. Help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.